Well, the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women will take place from today to the 25th of March under the theme Achieving Gender Equality and the Empowerment of All Women and Girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. We are now joined via Zoom by the Executive Director for the Masimanyane Women's Support Center, Dr. Lesley Foster. A very good afternoon to you, and as always, great to see you, Doctor.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me on the show.
You're most welcome. Dr. Foster, I believe that your organization, of course, reaches out to all kinds of women from all different walks of life. Would you say that, women are prioritized and empowered enough to excel and prosper in different spaces that they are in? I mean, when you interact with women, a lot feel that we are still sort of marginalized.
I have to agree with that view, because although we have many mechanisms in place and we really have tried, to address the issue of inequality, we have not won on this. Most women in the country, the majority of the women in the country, are still mired in poverty. They experience the effects of inequality as it plays, in an intersectional way in their lives. So we still have a very long way to go. And I think this is why the United Nations has chosen this particular theme. What is interesting about the theme is that it shows us that inequality is a very serious risk in the context of climate change and environmental disasters. And in our own country, we've seen where there have been floods, where there have been hurricanes and typhoons, that women and girl children suffer the greatest loss, not just of property, but they are at greater risk of violence. You hear about rapes, in emergency centers and so forth of young women and girl children. So these are the risks that we are talking about. But there are more risks, of course, risks such as loss of land, risks such as loss of property, and it impacts differently on women and girl children, which is why the whole world has its eyes on this issue at the moment.
And I mean, why haven't we won after so long? Why haven't we won when it comes to the issue of equality? You started off your sentence by saying we still haven't really reached that level of equality. And ironically, it's the women who bear the brunt of responsibilities. I mean, even when, there's a child involved, the man can wander off and go continue his life, but it will be the women who carry on bringing up the children and so forth. So one wonders why there is this inequality. And even if you look at how the disparity between pay, at work, men will obviously get more than women in most instances. Why is that?
Yeah, it's because of the patriarchy. Our society is a very deeply patriarchal society, which means that it favors men above women. So men have higher status in our society than women have. And this has to be dealt with at a societal level. So we have very strong political frameworks. We have the Constitution that guarantees our rights. We have legislation, we have policies, we have programs. But when it comes down to community level, family level, or individuals, what we find is that the obstructions and the challenges to women acquiring a higher status or simply being recognized and given dignity and respect is not there. So in the past, we've dealt with women mainly as the victims of violence and inequality. And the approach we're taking now is that we have a whole of society approach through our National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. And that plan looks at the economic aspects. It looks at all aspects of women's lives, including the land issue, which is a big one for the majority of rural women. But I think the commitment now is stronger. We've got the strongest political commitment we've ever had. But you will see that even when we have kind of progressive laws going to Parliament, it'll still be challenged, by people who are coming from a patriarchal perspective. So the battle is huge. It's not ours alone in South Africa. It is across the African continent and globally. This is why UN Women itself has a program called Generation Equality Forum, and that has got 6 action coalitions, which is looking at all of this. The bottom line is we have to change. We have to raise the status of women within our society, and the challenges to that by right-wing forces, religious forces, cultural, traditional forces are enormous. So the problem that we have is how do we actually make that change and build a society in which women are equal with men?
Doctor, I'm looking at the theme, and you touched on it briefly, and looking at this year's theme for the Commission on the status of women achieving gender equality in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. That sounds like such a mouthful, and one wonders really the importance of this particular theme. How do we see women fitting in these programs, and how can they actually then be empowered? I mean, if you're talking to a lay person, a lay woman, what are we saying in this particular theme? What are we talking about essentially?
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is that we have higher risks of in climate change, which is about disaster and environmental disasters and natural disasters, as we call them in our society. So what happens is that the disaster management programs haven't got a gender lens to them. So they're not looking at how women in particular are affected by climate change and environmental disasters. And this is a very big problem because the challenges are different. I remember when there was, this whole big disaster in Haiti, women were writing to us and saying, we don't have clothes for babies, we need caps, we need blankets, we need booty. And we're like, why would they be writing across the world for that? It's because the disaster management programs do not look at that. So in South Africa also we have problems where people lose their homes and they have to be put in temporary housing, and there's a huge risk when that happens because they're exposed to whoever wants, or has on their mind to commit violence. So we saw in the July, rioting in KwaZulu-Natal, for instance, that women were kept in buildings and raped continuously as an aside to the actual looting that happens. So in any kind of disaster, women become vulnerable to the violence that occurs. And this is why it's such a big thing. But there's also the loss of land, the loss of your home, the loss of your income or your food security, so crops get destroyed and so forth. And all of these things for rural women are particularly a huge challenge. So it's because of that we have to ask the question about how do we deal with this. And what we're saying is that when these disasters happen and the build back programs are put in place, women are left out of that conversation, and women are not contributing to what the build back policies and programs should look like. So this is also a huge risk to them. That just being left out of the decision-making process means that their concerns and their ideas of how the reconstruction should happen is not taken on board. And that's a very serious concern because women have a better idea of the spatial relationships and the spatial issues that need to be addressed when there has been a disaster. But too often they're left out of that process. And I think there's a lot of work that has to happen at local government level on training the people responsible for developing these programs and looking into what do ward councillors know and what do they understand. So again, patriarchy comes to the fore. It'll be the men who are at the front of those decisions. Women are left behind, and then they are at risk of all kinds of structural, systemic and interpersonal violence. So that's the big problem, is that there's the intersection of these different kinds of violence that women are laid bare to in the process of climate change and environmental disasters.
All right. Dr. Foster, it's always a pleasure having you here on SABC News with us, and hopefully we'll continue these sort of conversations with you in the near future. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
All right. That is Dr. Lesley Ann Foster, Executive Director for Masimanyane Women's Support Center.